The tensions that give birth to the Cold War can really date back to the unresolved issues of World War I. World War I is devastating to the entire Western model of government and economics. It is an implosion of the liberal order, and by liberal I don't mean today's modern Democratic Party. Instead, I mean a system that intends to advance rights, civil liberties, and representation to more individuals. World War I, to those on the outside looking in, is a clear demonstration that that idea is garbage. It's a clear idea to many inside the system as well that all the hope and faith that they put in the Enlightenment and its ideals was wasted and pointless. This especially became alienating to a group of people who have always felt themselves as kind of outsiders. And here I'm talking about Russians. Russia, since the early medieval period, found itself not quite European and not quite Asian, but rather an amalgamation of both and, well, neither. Now, following the Bolshevik Revolution and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that pulls Russia out of the World War I, and their following snub at the Paris Peace Conference, that feeling of being locked out by the West continues. In the years leading up to the invasion of Poland by Hitler, leaders in the West, like Neville Chamberlain in the UK, for example, knew they needed to engage Stalin to head off Hitler's aggressive nationalist expansion through Central Europe. They knew he was the key to slowing Hitler's role. And yet, they did nothing. They didn't reach out, they didn't engage, they held him at an arm's length. And he replied in kind, agreeing to the non-aggression pact with Hitler and dividing up Poland at the start of World War II. Fast forward 2 years later, and Hitler, shockingly to no one, abandons the non-aggression pact and attacks and invades the Soviet Union. Stalin begins talk with the Allies and their leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt. As the war bogs down in Russia, Russians are dying in troves. Hitler has thrown all he can at trying to conquer the Soviet Union, and the Russians in response are resorting to scorched earth tactics to deprive the Germans of everything. Stalin repeatedly begs Churchill and Roosevelt to open a Western front, particularly in France, to disrupt the German advance and force Hitler to divert his troops. Churchill and FDR stall, and finally, they open a front in North Africa, not France. It's not until June of 1944, with the D-Day invasion, that the Allies finally responded to Stalin's request. Meanwhile, 26 million Russians die in the war. Stalin won't forget this. He never declares war on Japan. He stalls and he stalls. The animosity and disrupt is ripe. Stalin has his own internal issues to worry about. The paranoid police state that he's created from his own insecurities means that he sees enemies everywhere. Wherever Churchill and Roosevelt want to have a conference to get on the same page for the war, Stalin at first refuses to leave the Soviet Union. He makes it seem like it's a power move, and he's making the democracies come to him, and sure, partially it probably is, but it also has to do with his own internal enemies and his concerns that if he's gone too long, that there will be a coup to overthrow him. So they meet first in Tehran, in Iran, in 1943, and then the next time they meet, it's at Yalta, which is in the Crimea, so right here. It's a resort town in the Soviet Union in southern Ukraine. And finally, they meet at Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin. Oh, here's Potsdam. This is my picture. I couldn't get Mr. Oliva to go to the house where the big three actually meet to kind of hash out their differences when they're in Potsdam, but this is what it looks like. At these meetings, it becomes clear that the visions for a post-war world between the Allies do not actually align. In fact, the visions for post-war Germany are super, super different. Stalin wants Germany gone, split up, non-existent. He says, how can we allow a country that has caused 2 world wars in 30 years to continue to exist? It's dangerous. He needs the resources to rebuild his battered country. Roosevelt and Churchill want a reconstituted democratic Germany, a demilitarized Germany, sure, but one that serves as a buffer against communism. So as you can see, there was already a good amount of distrust between the West and Stalin. They were really allies of convenience instead of conviction. Churchill and Roosevelt, however, were more than just allies. They were close friends. Roosevelt keeps Churchill informed about progress on the Manhattan Project, but doesn't inform Stalin. In fact, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are Stalin's first encounters with atomic weaponry. He, in many ways understandably, believed that this use of them on Japan was for his benefit, so that he could see the weapons of the Americans, his quote, allies, as a warning to him. He is also super salty that he wasn't treated like an equal ally compared to Britain. So after the war is over and Germany and Japan are defeated, Germany is divided into zones. And Berlin, too, is divided into zones. These zones are assigned to the military control and occupation of the Americans, the British, the French, and the Russians. Stalin, again, feels slighted because the French, who were controlled by Germany for most of the war, are basically given equal footing with him, who, as a reminder, lost 26 million people. These differences over how to deal with the defeated and basically disaster that is Germany and the immediate aftermath of the war give rise to the Berlin blockade, where Stalin has Berlin, which is 100% housed within the Russian sector of Germany, cut off. He does this because he feels that the U.S. is purposefully introducing the Marshall Plan to threaten him. And when the British, French, and the Americans, without inviting him and refusing to share the meeting notes with him, join their 3 zones and create a unified currency and jobs program, he, in response, cuts off Berlin, hoping to make the West look bad. It backfires as the Americans create a well-orchestrated relief program called the Berlin Airlift. By this point, what began as some mistrust has bled into a state of tension and mutual threat. This tension and mutual threat will grow to be the Cold War, a period that lasts almost 50 years after the end of World War II, and thankfully never erupts into outright war in this new bipolar world, but will have long-lasting effects for the entire community. As untenable financial commitments, loss of public support, and the destruction of the European era of superiority caused European empires to collapse one by one after World War II, many newly independent states emerged into the Cold War of competing ideologies between totalitarian communism and democratic capitalism. These newly independent nations often feel wronged by the imperialist powers that espouse their form of democratic capitalism. They feel that the system has let them down, has exploited them. And this opens the door for many so-called, quote, third world countries to choose the Soviet way of life, paving the way for the hotspots of conflict as the US and USSR vie for dominance in this brave new atomic world.